Thank you, Bess. And while we're waiting on others to come in, just give a moment to thank the entire committee that have helped sail our voyage, starting with Friday and ending now. And we're coming into port, and I'm glad we were able to reestablish the fellows' talks that were very much a part of our conferences in the past. And we're very proud and glad to have Dr. Brent Robbins and Dr. Peggy Kleinpatz as our fellows for Div 32. And very glad that in coming into port that we have Dr. Kleinpatz's guidance and wisdom to bring us on home. Dr. Kleinpatz is a professor with the Department of Family Medicine in the School of Epidemiology and Public Health at the University of Ottawa. And it's delightful that we are able to close our time together with a wonderful topic on optimizing erotic intimacy, a phenomenological, existential, and experiential approach to research, theory, and practice. So, Dr. Kleinpatz, thank you for being with us. We honor you for your fellow status, and congratulations.
Thank you very much. I am absolutely thrilled to be here, and there are many people I need to thank. So first of all, I need to thank the Society for Humanistic Psychology itself, and especially to the three people who nominated me, Dr. Eileen Serlin, Dr. Stanley Krippner, and Dr. Jonathan Raskin. Also, Dr. Christopher Maruk, who was head of the Fellows Committee, made it incredibly easy for me, notwithstanding the fact that I have some disabilities, which are about to be relevant. Also, the chair of the administration of all this at the APA level is Sonia Wiggins, who is incredibly kind and discovered I don't have web access. And Dr. Betts King, who is here with us today, has enabled me to be here with all of you. And in the last couple of days, also thanks to Dr. Brian Hanna, who helped to troubleshoot this craziness. So thank you all for coming today. But above and beyond those people, I need to thank Dr. Alvin R. Marr, AKA Al. That's a picture I took of him outside of his home right near the University of Ottawa about 15 years ago. He is now the late Dr. Marr. He was, as far as I know, the only person to serve as president of Division 32 twice. And I certainly would not be here if not for him. And you'll be hearing more about his influence on me and my work as an existential, phenomenological, experiential therapist and researcher as we go along. If any of you know him, I'm sure you're going to appreciate where I'm coming from. If you don't, first of all, that's me, and I'm thanking all of you. And second, I am highly interruptible. Don't even attempt to chat because there is no chat function. We are on my research team's website. So the password stands for Optimal Sexual Experiences. And it is a member of my team, Maxime Charret, who is in charge of tech support at the moment. So we're going to do this the old-fashioned way. We're going to actually discuss. So jump in, comment, question, whenever you like. Don't wait for the chat function. I wouldn't be able to see it if we had one, and therefore I would not be able to respond to you. So when you feel like saying something, just say something and just tell me who you are. And welcome. So I'm here to talk to you about sex therapy and existential experiential approaches. And you'll notice those words do not generally appear together in the same sentence. Sex therapy, and I am a card-carrying sex therapist, was designed to fill a clinical niche to help people who have DSM diagnosable sexual dysfunctions. An effective, brief, behaviorally oriented treatment model. But in fact, it was so effective that it's really become the Kleenex of psychotherapy. People don't bother to break it down. It's a generic. Once you know how to do sex therapy, you just do it. But the cost of something that was that effective was that nobody bothered to look at the underlying assumptions that were built into it. Now, if we switch headspaces, which I try to do as often as possible, and think about existentialism, it's got a whole other set of theoretical foundations and philosophical foundations, including its epistemology, which is mostly phenomenological, and its emphasis on the subjective, on meaning, on freedom and responsibility. And from my point of view, as well as the point of view of anyone who studies existentialism, it provides a way to think about human distress and suffering, the farther reaches of human nature, the mind-body problem, and other big questions that are important for people who self-define as existential or humanistic and or as experiential psychotherapists. So instead of my showing you all my references at the end, I'm going to stick them in along the way so you can see who are the people who have influenced my work in this funny place that is existential, experientially oriented sex therapy. So to me, it seems like a no-brainer. You know, sex therapists should study existential philosophy and experiential psychotherapies. And correspondingly, existential and experiential psychotherapists have traditionally shown minimal interest in dealing with sexuality. They're a natural fit. People should put them together. And as far as I know, the only people who are Division 32 members are Stanley Krippner, and I don't know if he's here. Someone holler if he's here. Stella Resnick, our previous speaker, Brent Robbins, who has a book coming out called Eros and Psyche. If any of these people are here, can someone yell at me, please?
Brent is here.
Who's here?
Brent Robbins is here.
Oh, hi, Brent. Your presentation before was just fantastic. I'm so glad you're here. So I'm thinking, you know, all sex therapists should be existential in theory, experiential in practice, and phenomenological in terms of research methodology. And all of us who are members of Division 32 should be interested in sexuality because it's where peak experiences can happen. It's where optimal erotic intimacy can happen. And we have so much to bring to the study of human sexuality. Now, in my world, the world of card-carrying sex therapists, the most common problem that we come across are problems around desire or frequency. In the world of mainstream psychotherapy, the outcome data on treatment of sexual desire concerns, unlike mechanical stuff like erectile dysfunction or pain on intercourse, our outcome data are lousy. And so in the last 5 years, your Food and Drug Administration has approved 2 new drugs for the treatment of low desire in women. And the in women bothers me because about half my clients with low desire are men. But we won't even go there right now. And so they've designed these new treatments, which are not selling. The second one there requires a woman who is not horny to inject herself in her belly so that she can sort of tolerate going along with sex, even though she still won't be horny in 45 minutes. That's about as good as it gets. So here are some existentially oriented people who have influenced my thinking. And I'm happy to share my reading list with you if you would like. I'm thinking that one of the things that Division 32 has to offer are alternatives to medicalization. Now, Brent Robbins, for example, talks about alternatives to medicalization when we think about psychopathology, and he's right. But our team has begun using phenomenological research methods to study people whose sex lives became richer and richer over time. It's humanistic psychology that's interested in the farther reaches of human potential. Why not also human erotic potential? Anyone want to jump in and make comments yet? Feel free, jump in, ask questions, chat the real old-fashioned way. Just unmute yourselves. So here very quickly are some research questions that we've been trying to answer since 2005. And I'm going to take you through some of this very quickly. I've presented on some of these previously at APA, so I won't go through them at any length, but this is basically what our team's been busy with for the last 17 years. So what I need to explain in the Faculty of Medicine is that phenomenological methods are ideal for discovery-oriented research. And it's kind of interesting being an existential psychologist teaching physicians. So I need to talk to them about how we're not going to do randomized trial, placebo-controlled outcome studies. We're interested in studying key informants, who, as you all know, are the people who have something to teach us. In this case, about optimal erotic intimacy. And here are the people that we decided to interview, people who might have something to teach us by virtue of being marginalized, people who've been forced to think about the higher reaches of optimal erotic experience by virtue of the fact that they are not considered the paragons of what great sex would look like. That is, old people and sexual and gender minorities, as well as people into kink and various other kinds of cool stuff. We also studied sex therapists. I mean, I think about the whole range of sexualities all day. I thought everyone else did too in my field. We'll come back to that. And if you're working at a university that's overwhelmingly quantitatively oriented, you need to be able to tell your colleagues, okay, well, where do you learn about phenomenological methodology? And here are some references that I rather like in case you're interested. They're probably very familiar to you. If they're not, call me. You'll get my phone number coming up. And so for the first studies that we began in 2005, we did a phenomenological study of interviews about an hour and a half each with 76 people. That's right, 76 participants or key informants in phenomenological research. That's a rather large number of phenomenological research interviews. But as I said, it's a quantitatively oriented university, so we needed lots of participants or they weren't going to let my grad students graduate. And the results, as you know, are presented in this methodology, not with graphs and charts, but with rich data. Our opening question was, what are the components of optimal sexual experience? Or to put it another way, how would you recognize great sex if you stumbled into it? As you all know, when you're doing this kind of research, you frame your question in many, many different ways so that your participant understands what the question is you're actually trying to answer. And sometimes when we'd ask, so how would you recognize great sex if you stumbled into it? People would say, pardon me, and we just rephrase the question. And sometimes people say, oh, like if I'm at a group sex party and there are like 150 people in the room and we're all having sex at the same time, how would I recognize who was having the greatest sex? And we'd say, sure. And they'd say, oh, it was the people who'd be smiling and laughing the most. That's how you know that they were having the best sex. And we'd say, thank you. So this is a study that we presented at APA a long time ago. and it was published, as you can see, in 2009. And these were the things that we found among our extraordinary lovers, that what made sex optimal for them was not about the common discourse of tips and tricks and techniques, positions, and sex toys. No, it was about stuff that, ta-da, existential humanistic theorists talk about a fair bit. So being present. And here I'm not talking about the kind of mindfulness that's currently trendy in mindfulness-based CBT or mindfulness-based stress reduction. I'm talking about the kind of being embodied and absorbed in the moment, such that you couldn't get distracted if an atom bomb hit. Most people who are studying MBCBT are learning about how to be present enough in their bodies so they won't get distracted by thoughts of doing their laundry during sex. But even if they get good at that, the question is how to do that at the same time that they're also fully aligned with one another in the moment, fully connected with one another in the moment. And that we already knew was going to be an interesting one for us clinically. How do we promote being fully absorbed in your own body while also fully aligned with somebody else at the same time? And here's some of the others that bring us back to, say, Rogers, 1954. If we talk about empathic communication or authenticity and genuineness, here we are talking about what are the qualities that enable optimal change in psychotherapy. Well, how do you like that? It turns out that they're also relevant for certain qualities of erotic intimacy. And so the results of this first study were that the components of optimal sexual experience were universal, though the particulars were unique. Even though the ingredients may look alike, no. What a particular experience is going to be about will be up to the participants in the moment. And so our first major study was quite a shock to my fellow card-carrying sexologists. The good news was that sexual functioning was not necessary for optimal sexual experiences. But the bad news is that their outcome goals, normative sexual functioning, were not sufficient for optimal sexual experiences. And I'm about to take you into our next study. But any questions about this one before I move on? Comments? You want to discuss? Anybody home?
Yeah, we're all here,
Okay.
Peggy, and I think this is a new paradigm for us to be talking in the middle of things. So I think people are a little skittish, but I'm sure if you keep encouraging them, they're going to pipe in.
Well, you can't see me and I can't see you. I've got some disabilities. So if you want to communicate with me, we're going to have to do this the 20th century way. You will have to actually talk with me. My apologies. And my excitement. So I will move on to our next study. So here are the conclusions of study 1, which animated all of our thinking about all of our future studies. By the way, I'll point out that when we first started presenting this stuff in 2007, 2008, everyone said to us, great, so you're going to give us a new standard, new hoops for our patients to have to jump through. And so, no, the moral of the story is technique ain't going to do it. You got to look within. And so that first picture you saw of me was me in full makeup. This one, not so much. Our next study was what can we learn about optimal sexuality? or more correctly, optimal sexual experience. There is no such thing as optimal sexuality, but only the experience of it. And what can we learn by studying those who've made it last a lifetime? So people in their 60s, 70s, and 80s whose sex lives got better and better all the time. And I won't take you through the whole study, but by all means, get in touch with me if you'd like references. And probably the most important of them was that great lovers are made, not born. That is, when we asked people what it was that led to them having better and better sexual experiences over time, we asked them that question too in a million ways. How did you start having this? Did you dumb down your expectations as you grew older? Did you get lucky? What happened? What did you do right? And it turned out that their best experiences began to occur when they stopped settling for mediocre sex. And that it wasn't going to happen naturally and spontaneously, but rather it was going to require considerable effort, intentionality, and devotion, like any other kind of optimal experience. And that meant that great lovers are made and not born. So when we ask people, when did you first have an experience of this caliber, the average age was somewhere in midlife. It took that level of personal development and maturity for people to gain the capacity to know themselves more thoroughly, more authentically, and to then choose to share themselves nakedly, not only literally, but metaphorically, such that their sex lives began to expand and become more fulfilling. And we asked them, well, what was your first step in that process? And everybody answered, it meant unlearning everything I'd ever learned about sex growing up. And as my fellow phenomenologists, I trust you know that this is an example of some of our data. It's in quotes because it comes from our key informants. And this comes from someone who was in his 70s at the time and whose sex life just continued to get better and better.
Peggy, I'd like to jump in. This is Todd Dubose.
Hi, Todd.
Just first of all, I want to thank you. It's just healing to hear this. You know, and I feel myself tearing up about it because it's, I know that the optimal sexual experiences I've had have come when I feel like I was failing at the techniques and the nature of the intimacy of the relationship brought the experience into the most fulfilling experiences that I've had, which actually confirms your research, at least in my own personal experience. And the idea of optimal as intimate, as full, you know, as kind of complete, you know, is very healing. And a few years ago, I had met and done some work with David Schnark. And when he came out with the Constructing the Sexual Crucible, it was so relieving to say that the best sex starts when you're 60. And I just turned 60 this year. And so all of this is extraordinarily healing. That's my first thing to say. The second thing is, at the same time, I'm always puzzled and curious again about almost like the escalation of a TikTok hookup culture. And that seems to be moving in the opposite direction of the intimacy that we're talking about. And I don't know if you could speak to that or will down the road, but thank you.
Thank you, Todd. And I knew David Schnarch really well, and it was a great shock when he suddenly died of a massive heart attack in 2021.
Mm-hmm.
Very sad. He was one of the very few others in this field to talk about optimal sexuality, though he referred to it differently.
Mm-hmm.
But we both agreed that sex got better and better as you got older if you were willing to dive deep within and to be true to yourself. And I'm going to talk a bit more about his work later. As for TikTok culture, on the one hand, I know nothing about it because I don't have web access. On the other hand, I know everything about it because all my clients are complaining about not being able to find the caliber of sex that they want in the hookups that they're expected to tolerate.
Mm.
And there is a lot of bad sex out there. And my objective is to promote looking within to find the caliber of sex that you can't get by looking out there.
Mm.
And I'm hoping we'll go further into exactly what you've just said. So thank you very much for sharing that.
Oh, thank you.
So if one of the myths in this instant culture is that sex is supposed to happen spontaneously and naturally, just fall into each other's arms when you meet someone hot. No. Again, we get a message that's important from existential humanistic psychology, which is that like anything else, it takes being present. It takes bringing one's intentions to it. And here's some quotes that we get that illustrate precisely this principle. And Todd, you might like this one. Yeah.
Yeah, everyone that says older man after it, I like. So.
Well, some of these were really exciting studies. My co-author, my then graduate student, Dana Menard, now my colleague, Dr. Menard, and I did all of these interviews ourselves, and we did them by telephone. And we were in the middle of interviewing this gentleman right here, if I remember correctly. Hold on, is this him? Yep, it's him. And all of a sudden, he said, can you hold on a second? I'm just having trouble breathing. And she and I are saying to each other, what do we do now? Do we call 911? What do we do? And he comes back on. We had asked everybody at the beginning of each interview whether they were able-bodied, disabled, healthy, not so healthy. And this guy identified as healthy and able-bodied. And so we're trying to figure out what the hell is going on. And he comes back and we say, what happened? And he said, nothing, I'm fine. I just had to go get my oxygen. We said, what do you mean get your oxygen? You said you were okay. And he said, well, I am okay. I just have COPD. So it's chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which is a terminal disease. And it's fairly serious. And we said, but you said you were fine. And he said, someone who looks on themselves as being somehow broken need not map to any kind of externally defined disability. It never struck me as being a defining issue in terms of sexual engagement, sexual passion. If there were a disability that restricts one's access to sexual fulfillment, I would say it was disability of the energy or the imagination. So right then and there, of course, I came on to him. And Dana said, you are not allowed to come on to our participants. And I said, I think he knows I'm kidding. I'm not his type. I'm too young and I'm too female. And he laughed and I laughed and Dana said, bad researcher, Peggy, stop that. But I just thought this was so cool. This is where I learned. This is where we all learn, by asking discovery-oriented questions of our informants, not by doing hypothesis testing. So starting 11 years ago, I began to think in terms of a death spiral. I'm Canadian. Canadians love figure skating. Picture Olympic figure skaters doing a death spiral. And I began to think in terms of how often people have sex for the wrong reasons. Initially for the right reasons. People have all heard that having sex is good for a relationship. But if they do it often enough without sexual desire, they end up having worse and worse and worse sex. So eventually, when there's low enough arousal during sex, you end up trying to get it over with as quickly as possible. And that means the quality of sex deteriorates until you're in the sexual relationship death spiral. It's a really poor diagram. That's okay. I'm hoping you get the idea. So in the face of sexual relationship death spiral, what we've learned from the extraordinary lovers, our key informants, is that there's a lot of lousy sex out there. And we need to change the discourse from people should have desire for sex to, wait a minute. Maybe low desire is normative if the caliber of sex you're having is miserable. And our goals as therapists should be to create sex worth wanting and to replace the dread that fills so many of my clients' lives with instead anticipation. Or to put it another way, what get diagnosed in the DSM as symptoms of hypoactive sexual desire disorder, or what's now referred to in women as female sexual interest and arousal disorder, are maybe not symptoms, but signposts. What if symptoms of desire problems are better understood as signposts towards wanting more? Maybe low desire is evidence of good judgment. Though what we should be assessing for is the quality of the sexual relations rather than just their quantity. And rather than essentializing desire, perhaps it can best be understood in terms of the quality of sexual relations. And you'll see that the second author on one of those, the third author on the next one, is Max Messera. Max, if you're still there, please say hello so that people know that you're there.
Oh, I said
Max is technically in charge of tech support here, but he is a brilliant young researcher. So I'll take you to study 3, which is really embarrassing to talk to my fellow SHP members about. As you know, phenomenological researchers do not do group differences. We don't do ANOVAs, we don't do ANCOVAs, we don't do MANCOVAs, we don't do any of that stuff. And for ethical reasons, starting in 2005, when we shared our transcript with the other members of our research team, they would read the transcripts and they would be unable to distinguish who was who. We weren't looking for group differences. I promise you, I'm a really good phenomenologist, at least in intent. I didn't go looking for group differences, but it was really interesting that all the members of our team, every time they got a new transcript, would say, oh, this guy sounds really hot. And we'd say, whatever makes you think this is a guy? And they'd say, well, it's not. And we'd say, we can't answer that. Our data have all been anonymized. Or they'd say, this straight person sounds really interesting. And we'd say, what would make you think this person was straight? And so on. And they got it wrong every time. All their guesses were wrong. And we thought that was just fascinating. But none of these differences appeared. Except that every once in a while, they'd read a transcript from the sex therapist, and they would say, oh, God, not another sex therapist transcript. And we would say, well, whatever would make you say that? And they'd say, this transcript is boring. All the therapists think that great sex is the stuff that requires normal sexual functioning. It happens in the first 6 months of your relationship, and after that, it's all downhill. And they've got those right every time. So we published an article about that in 2013, and we spent the first 2 pages apologizing to our fellow phenomenologists, saying, really, 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 we were not looking for group differences. We just couldn't help but notice that there were no differences among all the people who study optimal sexual experiences. And this lack of difference, which stood out to us, we couldn't help but write a paper about it. So apparently at the peaks of erotic intimacy, we all glow in the dark, uniquely but undistinguishably, unless you're a sex therapist, in which case I probably don't want to have sex with you. But remember, I'm an outlier. So here's what we found. And if you look at that top quote, it uses language like pureness and genderless, which are not in the Oxford English Dictionary. And the editor of the journal said, you can't use those words. Those words are not in the dictionary, and we're going to fix those. And I said, you can't, they're in quotes. They're in quotes. And so we got our participants' rich text in there unedited. Yay! That takes us to the end of our third study. Comments, questions?
Well, Peggy, as somebody who's got eyes on the audience, I can say that you're getting a few chuckles, that's for sure.
Oh, cool. Thank you. And you can all feel free to unmute yourselves and chuckle out loud if you would like. Or not. So this is our next major study. What are the contributors to optimal sexual experience? And again, at a quantitatively heavy university, I had to use words like factors that may contribute to or lead to or set the foundation for or bring about or predispose someone to having experiences of this caliber. And so, no, we did not do personality testing to find out what their personalities were like, but we listened to more key informants. And it takes a whole book to describe the answer to this study alone. And you'll see the cover of that book coming up. But if my icon is working properly, for my name, rather than seeing a picture of me, you see a picture of the cover of the book. And I am not a visually aesthetic person, so the people who get credit for having chosen the cover of the book are not the publishers, Taylor and Francis, but rather Maxime Charret, Diana Scamola, and Nick Parabi, all members of my research team who are brilliant artists. So here's what we found. Here are the contributors to optimal sexual experiences. And just make a note that there are a few things that stand out here. One is that there's a temporal quality to the factors that bring up the elements of sex. Some of them happen in development, like having been lucky enough to come from a sex-positive family or getting great sex education. Some of them are enduring elements of the individual or the relationship. And some of them are things that happen immediately before you have sex, and others happen during sex. And you put them together, and they eventuate in optimal erotic intimacy. So note that there's color coding here. The amber is for individual elements. The blue is for interpersonal or relational elements. Make a note. We'll come back to this. And if Todd DeBose is there, pathway B is what David Snarsh writes about.
Yes.
How differentiation facilitates the fulfillment of sexual potential. So I can't possibly take you through all of this. But I will say that one of our big factors was willingness. Think of it as a meta factor. The willingness to open the door within, the willingness to open the doors to greater intimacy. And by intimacy, I do not mean the euphemism. I mean really coming to share one's inner world with another at a fairly deep and high level. We are, after all, the third force in psychology. So am I willing to go there? And am I willing to do it with you? Or all of you? But I thought I would talk to you just a little bit about the relationship factors that turn out to be crucial. But probably the most crucial of all the relationship factors, if you can ignore that word factors, is empathic communication. Where the emphasis is not on just words, but also whether I allow myself to touch you in such a way as to feel you through my touch. Do you allow yourself to open to me, literally, so that I can penetrate you literally and metaphorically, so that I can know you through our interpenetration? But there are also two elementary, omnipresent prerequisites: consent and mutuality. Now, bear with me because I'm Canadian, and I know that in an American context, consent is rather yes, no. You consent or don't you? And if we're to learn from these key informants, consent was something way, way, way more nuanced. It was something that takes place from moment to moment, at every moment of erotic intimacy. And here we really learned a lot, not only from people in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, but also from our participants who are consensually non-monogamous or into kink, where navigation of consent is far more subtle and far more respectful. And I would also argue, no, I wouldn't argue, Almar argued, that's the way experiential psychotherapy needs to be. So, as many of you members of Division 32 know, we all need informed consent for psychotherapy. But if you're practicing experiential psychotherapy, consent is ongoing during each session. And I should clarify that there are over 50 different kinds of small e experiential psychotherapies, plural. The only thing they all have in common is the belief that affect is important for psychotherapeutic change. But if you're talking about capital E experiential psychotherapy, that's the one developed by my mentor, Dr. Marr. So when you're reading literature, look for that capital E, and you'll know that's his. And he wrote extensively about how consent is utterly crucial for experiential psychotherapy to be effective. And I just thought I would show you a quote from one of our participants. And we have a chapter in the book on skill. It's the shortest chapter in the book, where it turned out that the most important skills for optimal sexual experience are beyond what today gets dumbed down as mindfulness. What today is cultural appropriation of ancient Buddhist and Hindu disciplines, not something you can learn in a weekend. it's mindfulness in the ancient sense. And it's something that we used to see in the humanistic literature of 1965 to maybe 1972, 73, the ability to be centered. So it's a term we've tried to bring back into the literature, being embodied and absorbed. And what we're talking about here is what would show up as the first step in Gendlin's focusing, or the first step in Mars experiential psychotherapy. And we'll come back to this later. And that's him again. This is another picture I took of him. And that's right outside his house, about 15 years ago. Hi, Al. I miss you. And that's a picture of Al with me in my dining room. The knife is for birthday cake. I made him a chocolate cake, which was his favorite for his 75th birthday. If you aren't studying his work, you should study his work. So what did we learn from these first 5 studies? Or rather, these first 4. What we learned was that enduring erotic intimacy requires very high levels of embodiment, not low-level MBCBT levels of mindfulness, quote unquote. The capacity to be authentic within while connected and engaged with another, impressive rather than merely effective skills of verbal and touch communication, and vulnerability combined with the freedom to take chances without worrying about making mistakes. So you'll notice that we end up using the language and the concepts of existential humanistic theory. And before I move on to our 5th study, questions, comments, notions, chuckles. I'm starting to worry that not everybody got here who wanted to get here. But okay, I will continue.
Peggy, it's Todd again. I've got a lot of questions, but one that I find interesting is as you're talking, I keep thinking about where to place asexuality in this discussion. And with that definition, it can reframe asexuality as sexual in a different kind of way. And I didn't know if that makes sense to you or if you'd want to speak to that.
I've been around just long enough to not understand and know that I don't understand any term that's been around for less than 10 years. People keep changing language. And as an experiential psychotherapist, I know that it's important to accept people's self-identification and never question it. So if somebody tells me I'm asexual, I'm going to say, okay. But if somebody told me I'm schizophrenic, I would say, okay, while I don't really understand what either of those things means in that language.
Mm-hmm.
All I know is that's how this person identifies. But if you ask me to understand the construct as a construct, I don't know what either of them mean. So all I'm in a position to do as a therapist is enter the client's lived experience and to find out what it means to this client. But if you ask me how to make sense of the concept of asexual, I'm going to ask you what you mean by that.
Mm-hmm.
No, I'm actually asking you what you mean by that.
Oh, you actually asked me. I'm thinking about it as a cultural construct of neither having desire for active physical sexual activity and again, it spreads across the spectrum of whether one's romantic or not. What strikes me is, I think the folks that I've talked with who feel they are asexual or no non-REM can read this description and certainly find the sense of fulfillment in their own lives that they have. And I think the shift that's important with your research is, again, shifting it away from acts and techniques to ways of interpersonally being.
I love what you just said. And I can tell you that I've never met anybody in therapy who's self-identified as asexual, but probably 2 days a week, a couple comes into me, my office, that is, and says, I have a high sex drive, but my partner is asexual. They're being labeled as asexual by a partner, and they don't identify that way, nor do they object to it. If anything, it's rather convenient for them to be able to say, well, I don't know. Because if they accept the label, then the price is that they agree to self-define as defective. But the gain is that their partners are going to stop bothering them for the kind of sex they don't want.
Mm-hmm.
So I see that as about the politics of experience more than anything.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think?
I agree.
Oh, cool.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Peggy, this is Chris here. I just appreciate what you just said about the politics of experience in this conversation, because I feel like that's where a lot of people get hung up, which is who's failing, who's succeeding, who's to blame, where's the problem? And I appreciate the HE framework here to move away from that sort of good, bad definition of this experience, and to instead deepen in an exploratory, non-judgmental way what is real for people involved.
Thank you. That really means a lot to me. The next book I'm working on right now is actually going to apply some of Lang's thinking about the politics of experience and the false self to how people behave in relationships, and in particular in sexual relationships. And I haven't told anybody that before. So thank you, Chris. And be sure to get in touch if you want to talk further.
Thank you.
Thank you. So if you're in the world of couples therapy, there is quite the fight going on between the EFT folks who argue that what's necessary to have a decent sexual relationship, they're not interested in great, but decent sexual relationship, is secure attachment, versus maybe what's needed is personal development. That would be Snarsh and Company, and they would say it's all about differentiation. And so we studied that, again, through phenomenological research methods, and we asked, who's right, the differentiation folks, the attachment folks, or is there more than one path? And here's what we found. And now you see the reason for the color coding. Sometimes a relational context does facilitate an individual's way of being, and that in turn facilitates optimal sexual experience. But sometimes it's the other way around. It's the way of being that facilitates qualities of the relationship, which in turn lead to optimal sexual experience. Or sometimes, I want you to think about this. And which humanistic psychologist speaks about just this? Any guesses? So watch the quote, because this comes from one of our key informants. And when I first heard this, I thought, I know this quote. Because I've been using this quote in my teaching and knew it by heart. This was Maslow's response to Freud. If Freud is saying that the basis of mate selection was the Oedipal complex, Maslow's response was, maybe or maybe that's not true for the average person. But as Maslow wrote, the people with whom self-actualizers fall in love are soundly selected by either cognitive or conative criteria. If you aren't old enough, conative was the 1970 language for behavioral criteria. That is, they are, Maslow's emphases, intuitively, sexually, impulsively attracted to people who are right for them by cold, intellectual, clinical calculation. Their appetites agree with their judgments and are synergic rather than antagonistic. Is that not cool? And by the way, I believe that was also the year that Maslow was president of the APA, the last time we had a humanistic psychologist who is president of the APA. So some of us are still rooting for Kirk Schneider to run again. Is Kirk Schneider here? I'm a big fan of Kirk Schneider. So what did we learn here? We learned it isn't differentiation versus attachment. It's personal growth and relational depth. But different people are going to come at this differently with different sequences. And to me, that means get ready for a ride. So I'm hoping all of you are familiar with Hogwarts and Harry Potter. Regardless of how you may feel about J.K. Rowling at the moment, this image has really stayed with me. What we're asking clients to do in therapy is to enter not quite knowing where you're going, except that if you're an existential, humanistic, experiential psychotherapist, you're aiming for growth. You're aiming for height. You're aiming for fulfillment of potential. And that means the willingness to stay on the staircase even as the ground is shifting beneath you, and to be willing to jump off from one onto another pathway as experience dictates, if you're willing. What did that mean for our research team? And there's Max's name again. It meant that we were never going to be able to come up with manualized treatments. If we go back to the problem that I deal with all day, every day, sexual desire problems. By definition, we had to be able to do as therapists what we were asking our clients to do and what our key informants were able to do, to be in the moment with our clients, to enable people to become all that they can become, rather than try to fit them into normative performance standards. So if our next plan was to try and find a therapy approach, how the hell were we supposed to do that? And so we spent a couple of years trying to figure out, okay, we know what optimal sexual experience looks like. What if we took the first 5 studies you've just looked at and aimed to help couples move from low desire low frequency, and sexual desire discrepancies. That is dreadful sex. The sex worth wanting. And could we do that by aiming at optimal sexual experiences now that we knew what they looked like, without ever having to settle for regression to the mean? And I would ask any of you who are interested in collaborating to please contact my research team at optimalsexualexperiences.com. I don't have web access, but my research team will be able to see your message. Or rather, it'll tell you my phone number and our research team coordinator's email address. So here's what we've been doing for the last few years. And for this, please forgive me, we had to do mixed methods research. So we're doing pre-tests and post-tests and follow-up at 6 months. We decided to use Yellow's model of group therapy. And we developed a treatment model. So not step by step by step, but model of couples sex therapy using the work of Yalom to see, could we make a difference in couples' sex lives? Where the goal was not to have them have more sex, but to have them create the kind of sex lives that would be loaded with the potential for desirable sex. So what are the kinds of things we're focusing on in the 8 sessions? Embodiment, engagement, authenticity, playfulness, trustworthiness, and vulnerability, among others. And I told you I wouldn't show you my references at the end. I'm showing them to you as we go along. Here are the people whose thinking really influenced mine. And animates the work of our team. Our ethics board has been extremely supportive. In the first year or two, the participants were people who were drawn from my waiting lists. I'd had a waiting list of 7.5 months for most of my career. And I really wanted to get rid of the waiting list. So I just put everybody into group therapy. At the same time, there was a pharmaceutical group who were developing a treatment for low sexual desire in women, approved in the US in 2015, here by Health Canada in 2018. And I would just like you to read their exclusion criteria. I wish you unmuted yourself. I'm hoping you're really laughing your heads off.
Peggy, it's Bet's King. I'm more snorting and rolling my eyes.
Yeah, they invited me to do the pre and post interviews. And when I sat down with their pharmaceutical reps, I just couldn't stop laughing. And who is there going to be left once these are your exclusion criteria? So we decided we would let everybody in unless they were on the kinds of antidepressants or hormonal contraceptives or anti-anxiety drugs known for causing low desire. And at the end of that year, with those exclusion criteria, we had nobody. Nobody. The popular drugs prevent desire. So at the end of the year, we got rid of even that exclusion criteria, and we kept only domestic violence and being at the point of filing for divorce. And within just a few weeks, we eliminated our waiting lists. I will also point out that we were running groups before COVID, and then COVID hit. Max, feel free to jump in here. So we had 76 couples in our group therapy prior to COVID, and then 64 since the onset of COVID. We were doing really well. And then it's like, okay, now we have to stop all therapy because it has to be done remotely and I don't have online access. My research team, quite rightly, went ballistic. But much to my amazement, so did the ethics board of the University of Ottawa and my licensing board here in the province of Ontario. They said, hey, spoiler alert, you've developed, please forgive my language, an empirically validated treatment, which you published in 2018 and published in 2020. And now you're going to stop offering it when people need it most. So our team started running group therapy remotely through the HIPAA compliant Zoom. And here's how we did it. We did 3 hours of the same stuff that our extraordinary lovers, our key informants, told us was necessary for them to become the kind of people who could then be capable of optimal sexual experiences. And that's we help them unlearn the message from their developmental histories that limited sexual and erotic potential. But then we moved straight into experiential psychotherapies, plural, but with the heavy emphasis on Mar, Gendlin, and Fritz Perls. You'll remember Perls, 1971, wrote Lose Your Mind and Come to Your Senses, which has become one of the mottos of our research team. So here are the crucial skills that we were working on from sessions 2 to 8. Jump in when you have questions. You're about to have questions. There was no sensate focus. If you are a card-carrying sex therapist, you know that that is the mainstay of Masters and Johnson's style of sex therapy. There are a lot of exercises, for lack of a better term, and I'm using the term exercise or experiment in the Gestalt sense, to help promote feeling while touching and allowing oneself to be felt through touch. And by the way, when it comes to studies 6 and 7, here are the people who are currently working on the research on optimal sexual experience group therapy during COVID. Max, can you at least please say hello, just so I know you're there?
Yep, hello.
Thank you. See, I told you your picture would be there.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and all groups are run by dyads of therapists. So the guy in the top right-hand corner, Nicolas Praradi, has been my co-therapist since 2013. And he's absolutely a wonderful therapist. So he and I do all therapy sessions together. But one of the foundations of our team has always been about social justice and accessibility. So when you do group therapy, not only do you eliminate waiting lists, but as it turns out, there's no winter driving. And that meant we could offer therapy to people in remote communities like Northern Ontario or rural Iowa, because we've now trained 65 therapists throughout North America and also in the UK to offer this kind of therapy. And we're finding out that this therapy is cost effective, which should matter to all of us. And we're offering groups for people with every kind of a sexual or gender proclivity. And for those of you who just love quantitative data, here's some for you. And I don't do stats, but Max does. Max is really good at this stuff. And here's what he found. And the first time he said, you know, Cohen's D of 1.0, I said, no. You know, numbers go from like -1 to +1. Isn't it like a Pearson's correlation? And he said, no, Peggy, it's not. You can actually get bigger numbers. And I said, well, how big is a Cohen's D of 1? He said, it means really significant effect. So it's not just that we got P less than 0.001, so the odds of this being a fluke are 1 in 1,000, but it actually made a big difference. How big? Cohen's D of 1.0. That's big. But look at the items in which we found significant differences from pre-test to post-test with a probability of 0.001. See, I'm taking you full circle now. Here are the items in which there were really significant differences. Not just the obvious stuff like sexual arousal, but the intensity of sexual arousal, variety, frequency, pleasure, yes, sexual functioning too, but also the partners taking care of one's sexual needs, mutual emotional opening up during sex, positive sexual reactions to the partner, communication of sexual wishes, preferences, and desires, balance between giving and receiving, creativity, letting go, and surrendering to sexual pleasure during sex, focus during sex, and mood after sex. Yeah, none of that's in the DSM. But this, as it turns out, is what it takes to create sex worth wanting. So the cure for low desire is desirable sex. And then we did 6-month follow-ups. And holy cow, the global measure of overall satisfaction with sex life showed the largest increase, and a Cohen's D of 1.04. And then I made Max go back and double check it because it's like, I don't know what I'm doing, but he does. And he said, no, this is for real. And we checked with another prof of epidemiology, and he said it's real too. So it's like, okay, this stuff works. So what accounts for all this improvement? Well, here we come back to the basics of humanistic psychology. It's not focusing on the genitals. It's not focusing on sexual acts or sexual functioning, but rather on the contextual aspects that make sex desirable. And it freed people from feeling pathological and defective for not being interested in the relatively lousy sex they'd been having, or if they were smart, not having for years. And here I'm going to show you some actual quotes from actual clients. As I said, we shifted over from straight phenomenological research to mixed methods. Yes, we did have some paper and pencil tests, but we also solicited feedback in writing as well as orally. And I love this quote. I just love this quote. So one of the things that we learned from our extraordinary lovers, our key informants, was that they had to be feeling just safe enough, that's the attachment piece, to take some interpersonal risks and grow together. And we actually introduced that as another one of our mottos during session 4. And we talk about what would just safe enough to take some risks look like for you? And here's a quote from one of the couples that we actually got this feedback from. Although risk initially meant to me something like kinky exploration or being very bold and daring in some way, and at the beginning of a relationship or youth, there's so many risk factors. Pregnancy, timing, moves, readiness, the relationship, and other relationships that might be affected, that after all these years, risk is still present in the basic fears of, am I lovable enough? Is my offering good enough? Will I be perceived as offensive in some way? These risks go underground and are easily dismissed by logic. How can that be present after all these years? And yet my hunch is that these basic underlying fears make it so that risk is never entirely absent from sexual contact, even with a life partner, and that conquering those fears by daring to offer intimacy and connection and being received again and again is always gratifying, affirming, and love generating. Chris, is this speaking to you?
Of course, Peggy. It's very powerful, and I think it speaks to you would never get this in something that didn't allow for someone to speak this way about their experience, in the research.
Yeah, well, obviously I didn't say this, a participant did.
Right.
But it was so cool to get this written feedback. So we had to turn this upside down and paradoxically nurture the capacity to think about sex as any other pursuit that had the potential to improve with time, energy, not work, you'll notice, but energy, creativity, and commitment. And then 2 years ago, when our most recent study was published, we started getting phone calls from people saying, hey, if this works for couples facing complex sexual difficulties, and if it works during COVID, which means you can offer it remotely, you need to start offering it to couples facing cancer because they're immunocompromised. And nobody talks to people with cancer about the effects of chemo and radiation and surgery and endocrine therapy on their sex lives. I mean, in fairness to chemotherapists and radiologists, they're busy saving lives. They aren't paying a whole lot of attention to the quality of life. So this is Max's doctoral dissertation. Invite him here in about 5 years, and he'll tell you what we find. This is what we're working on right this minute. So our conclusion so far is that couples sex therapy groups can help clients to explore themselves more deeply and to create just enough safety in their relationships to take the risks involved in deep self-revelation with one's partners. And in using this approach, we support clients in creating the conditions for extraordinary erotic intimacy such that sex becomes desirable. And this is the book we wrote about this stuff. So if you're interested, it's out there. Whoop, whoop, whoop. And we have a website. That's our website. So you'll notice when you logged in today, you logged into OSE, which stands for Optimal Sexual Experiences. That's our website. I can't access it. But there's my phone number. And you can call me any afternoon, Eastern time, and I will pick up the phone. If I'm with a client, you'll get a 20th century busy signal. If you're calling from a cell phone, you might not hear a busy signal depending on your carrier, and it might say something like, this number is not available. That's not true. I'm always available. But if I'm with a client, you will not be able to reach me. So just, try me again. But don't bother trying to email me because I won't get it. It's just not an option. And this is the person who runs my life and who has enabled this website. Her name is Jessica Vertenière, and she is the research team coordinator. And here's some references of our publications about this work in the last 15 years or so. I'm guessing it's this stuff that's enabled me to become a fellow of APA. And here are some more of the things we've done. You see that? Even phenomenologically, existentially, experientially oriented therapists get published in mainstream journals. Frightening, isn't it? We're infiltrating them. And here's some that are specifically about optimal sexual experiences. Look at that. That top one actually got published in the Journal of Sexual Medicine. So if you're a sexologist, that's considered a high-impact sexology journal. And that brings me to where I say thank you. But we started late, and we still have a few more minutes. If you have any comments or questions.
Hey, Peggy, this is Brian. I just wanted to say thank you. Like, this was very cool to kind of soak up, and I'm really, it's going to take me a minute to just digest the way, like, I'm really fascinated by your use, like your discipline with the phenomenological method and integrating that with the mixed methods research. And I'm really interested in different ways where we're going to continue to document the rigor of our approach, and so that's something that like I'm really kind of soaking up from your work here. So yeah, thank you for sharing that, and certainly congratulations on the fellow.
Thank you. I'm really excited about all this stuff, and I'm very grateful for your feedback. And to me, it seems kind of sad that there's much less openness to this kind of work in mainstream psychology than there is, God help me, in mainstream medicine. I mean, Max is doing his PhD in the Faculty of Medicine in epidemiology, where they're really open to this kind of research. I get to give the lecture in their research methods course each year on phenomenological research. And the students all say, yep, yep.
Well, Max, no need to wait 5 years, man. Come on over next year.
Max recently presented at the International Society for Sexual Medicine on how well our research works during COVID online. So thank you, Max. Other questions, comments, concerns? You want to take back the awarding of me as a fellow? I'm doing too much quantitative research.
I think, no, this is Todd again. Again, I think we need to figure out where the optimal fellow award is. so it's
just made my day.
It really has been an excellent presentation. And what I find it's interesting because one of the things I'm very concerned about is trying to move away from a hierarchical disease model. And so I usually recoil around words like optimal because I'm concerned of who gets left out, who's not optimal, and how that may breed a shaming of anybody less than-ness. And so it's nice to see the paradox of how y'all are using optimal in your own research, because I think the tendency is to try to get away from what we feel is inadequate in order to achieve the optimal, but it's actually the other direction in relation to what you're trying to do. And Yeah, it's just, it's an interesting kind of, it opens up all kinds of things to think about. So thank you. And thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation.
You're very welcome, and I'm very grateful for your feedback. We, as I said earlier, had received so much questioning feedback from our field saying, you know, is this stuff that you've done in your early years, you know, just about something that's interesting about a few odd people, exceptional people? Or have you come up with any findings that could matter to the rest of us? And I think what we've discovered is relevant for anybody who wants to get outside of being pathologized, outside a model that says you're defective for not wanting the miserable sex you're having. And instead, what can we do as therapists to help you discover who you might become if you wish as a sexual being, and to optimize all that you might be capable of experiencing if you're with someone who is worthy of your trust? And there are choices for us each to be made.
And I guess one of the things that I'm interested in is starting with the almost a phenomenology, and certainly a therapeutic phenomenology of what's considered lousy sex. What is it about the experience that one has of concern? And I think starting there with an embrace and invitation to embrace where one is, I think I would imagine very important for someone being open to move to openness to other experiences.
Yeah.
I also want to remark, I think you'd like this, that when I met David Schnarch, I had my copy of Constructing the Sexual Crucible with me, and I wanted him to sign it, and he signed it, the most loved copy I've ever seen, because it was so tattered and marked up.
I remember him very fondly. Any other comments, questions?
Peggy, it's Bets. And, you know, in the Oscars tonight, one of the films that are up for an award, it's a film called CODA, which stands for Children of Deaf Adults. And I am a CODA, and as such, an advocate for deaf folks. And psychology has failed them in so many ways, because when you bring an interpreter into a session, there's an automatic triangulation. And you've just got me thinking so many thoughts about the sex lives of deaf people and how this might be helpful to them. So much like Brian, I don't have a lot of words yet, but I have a lot of thoughts. And so I want to thank you for that.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your sharing that, and more for us to think about. If you come up with stuff and you feel like sharing them with us, you know how to get in touch, and I hope you will.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It's work nobody's doing. I can guarantee you that.
That strikes me as a pity. And if anybody should be doing it, it's us as existential, humanistic, experiential psychotherapists with phenomenological methods for our research. It's such an obvious fit for us to take on. And I'm blessed to have had Al Marr as a mentor for so many years, who taught me all these things. And when I wanted, to worship at his altar, he said, "Not a chance. Your job is to take my work and apply it elsewhere." I said, "But Al, you don't do couples therapy." And he said, "Right, you start. You expand it." A great mentor.
Hey, Peggy, my name is Betsy Duke. And I just wanted to say thank you for including polyamorous folks in your study. I'm a polyamorous person myself, and I have never been included in a study on sexuality. And I always feel like that's a shame. So I just wanted to say thank you on behalf of consensually non-monogamous people everywhere.
Well, you are more than welcome. And certainly in that first study, it was very cool when we got to study not just individuals or couples, but on occasional, especially privileged moments, to study all the members of a polycule and hear them all describe what made sex so fulfilling for each of them. So thank you for sharing that. And sexologists really have a responsibility for studying more widely.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Peggy, this is Irene Siegel, and I just want to thank you. I find your model really interesting. You know, there's such new language out there and definitions out there for all different types of sexual identity, and this kind of just takes it out of categories, you know, and just puts it into the experiential. And I really appreciate that. And I'm just taking it in and mulling it over, and I really liked your presentation. So thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate the feedback. I'm still thinking about something that I believe Todd said earlier about studying miserable sex lives. And about 20 years ago, I was in the middle of a session with a couple, and I had asked them to describe their most recent sexual experiences. And they described them. And I wasn't really thinking, but I guess I was just being authentic and said, well, I really like sex, but if I had the sex life you're having, I wouldn't want it either. And then sort of went, I can't believe I just said that out loud. And I didn't do it as a technique. I just did it because that's what came to me. And they were so relieved. They felt so validated that somebody who actually likes sex wouldn't like their sex life. Yeah, we need to take people where they are and ask them where they want to go. And if they want to aim for that which is deepest and highest within, help them expand and grow so that they can achieve, if they so desire, so that they can experience all that they have within them to become.
You know, it's so interesting you say that, Peggy, because the times when I've done something like that in therapy, I felt like I've blown it. I mean, it's like, you know, I failed, it was awful therapy, and then the clients say it's the best session they've ever had. And it's kind of a parallel process of what we're talking about, you know, it's about when the couple relaxes off of the report card, you know, and embrace the humanness, then things take off, you know, and surprises us, which makes me, again, this is part of the experiential piece, really how for me, I'll talk about the authority rests in the phenomenon itself. Let the experience teach us where we're going, and very core to experiential psychotherapy, and just being able to trust that process. I want to respect Peggy's time, and Peggy, you're welcome to hang and talk, but I know people may have to take off. Just before we get away, without forgetting it, I just want to say once again, congratulations on being one of our fellows. We are honored to be able to call you one of our fellows, and look forward to more and more interactions in the future. And Max, all of your research team, good luck on your research. You're doing wonderful work for us all. Thank you very much. And thank you all for attending our conference. We're docked in on shore now. So take what we've learned and let's take it even further. Thank you.
Thank you, Todd. Thank you, Peggy.
And Beth,